Rolling.
Right. Well, I'm asking each laureate about some of their roots, how they got started. And you're quite proud of your Midwestern roots, from what I've gathered in reading about you. How did those roots shape your values and your worldview in ways that helped you succeed in the business world and leading a satisfying life as well?
Well, I wouldn't trade my Midwestern heritage for anything. While at the time I didn't realize the value of growing up in the Midwest, in retrospect, and really only recently I've come to understand that the lifestyle and growing up in the Midwest, not that I would ever trade my graduate education and my exposure to the East very shortly after I got through college, but I wouldn't trade the fact that I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and it seemed to me it's given me sort of a sense of balance, and that in combination with the sophistication of an Eastern education, which I also was lucky enough to have, I think I became a person that I would consider fairly well-rounded. But in looking back, I thought the opportunity to grow up in the Midwest was one that is proven very valuable to me.
You described it as having a sense of clear-headed realism and unambiguous ethics. How did it do that?
I think that's an overstatement.
Okay.
I just think that there's a sense of balance and a sense of appreciation of a broad sense of values that you gain from living in the environment of the Midwest. I'm not sure it has done much for my clarity of thinking.
Were there role models that influenced you on the way up?
Well, I think everyone has teachers and professors that one remembers as having played a significant role in one's past. I had 2 or 3 of those going back to 3rd grade, and then in high school, and certainly I had 1 or 2 in college, and 1 or 2 in graduate school, and then I had at least 1 or 2 in the business world who were just giant men who they did think clearly, and they helped me learn the process of decision making. So I think everyone in their life could identify 5 or 6 people who helped them become what they eventually turned out to be.
Would you mind talking about a couple of them?
Pardon?
Would you mind talking about a couple of them and what they might have passed along to you?
Well, there was an executive vice president of FMC who was brought in from academia, as a matter of fact, an unusual combination of backgrounds. And he was a very insightful person who was courageous in his decision-making, could walk through plants and tell you immediately what the problems were and what kind of management style was being used and what changes should be made. So there are a few people like that I think everyone has been exposed to and benefited from knowing in one's career.
What was his name?
His name was Dr. Carl Prutton.
As you look around you today, you're in a different business situation than we might have been when you started in your career. It's truly global competition today. What sort of values should today's corporate leader possess?
Are you asking the question, differentiating the values that one had when I started my business career?
No, but what sort of worldview should they possess today? Strategic thinking toward dealing with a truly global economy.
Oh, obviously, the challenges of business today were very different than when I started. I don't think the values that one has as a leader should be any different today than they were then. I think they're fairly constant. So if you talk about the need for different kinds of understanding, the different management techniques that are required, the different relative importance of various aspects of the total decision-making process in business, obviously they are different today. Certainly during my career I've seen business go from one that was incredibly provincial, at least that's the way I would describe it in retrospect. At the time I thought it was relatively sophisticated, but to one that is definitely global, and where it's very obvious, this is not very insightful, that those companies who succeed are going to understand that that the world is their market, and that their competitors exist throughout the world, and they have to be sensitive and conscious, and businesses have to learn how to deal with different cultures, and they have to be sensitive to the significance of those cultures, and as American businessmen, we have to learn how to adapt to the cultures in the countries where we have to operate. And I think too many Americans historically, maybe some even today, think that we are so advanced in terms of our modus operandi and our culture that we will benefit the rest of the world by bringing all these assets to them. And those who understand that that's not the case are going to be the ones that succeed.
We're learning a lot from people in other countries as we sit down and make our own decisions. You speak about the value of having a complete outlook, a well-rounded person, not just confined narrowly to the core issues in their business. Could you speak to that as far as what a complete person is in your view?
Well, I don't think I want to take on a complete person. What I would be willing to do is talk about a complete businessman, sure, because I don't want to fly under false pretenses. I have been a businessman. It seems to me that the difference between those who succeed and those who don't are those that have an ongoing curiosity, who continue to learn, who continue to reach out for things that are not directly associated with their businesses, but all of which have peripheral value to them as businessmen. And I think we can go back in our own careers, all of us, and think of the number of people who were voted most likely to succeed in kindergarten and grade school and high school, college, even graduate school, and how many of those that were perceived by their peers as those that were going to take over the world in fact haven't. What is the difference between those who are perceived as having those leadership capabilities in the early parts of their career and those that in fact turn out to have them? I claim it's those who continue to grow, those who continue to become educated, those that are curious. That's the simplest common denominator I have to describe those people who I think during the course of a long career tend to lead.
How's that been a factor in your own life? You have widely varied interests, from politics to the environment. You're curious about a lot of things.
Well, I would have to say that none of it was a conscious effort on my part. I didn't say I will be a more successful businessman if I take an interest in politics or if I take an interest in public policy organizations. Those were interests that I had, and where pursuing those interests clearly had benefit to me, at least I perceived they did, in terms of my own career. But at no point do I remember saying, I must reach out. It is in my best interest to do these other things in terms of what I'm trying to be. They all were sort of natural interests, but they clearly had an impact on one's success in business. At least that's my perception. I also feel very strongly that business leadership today has to become involved in the external world, whether it be contributing to eleemosynary institutions that need business thinking, or whether it means becoming involved in politics. I think if businessmen do not become involved in politics, they deserve what they get. And that means understanding issues. It doesn't necessarily mean running for office, but it does mean understanding issues. It means knowing the candidates, knowing who you're voting for, the positions that they're going to take. Because basically we should be electing people to exercise their intellect, and we have to understand what that intellect is and what positions those people are going to take. And we have to work very hard to elect the people that we think are going to function and govern it in the best interests of society, including the business community. So I think a businessman who does not become involved in politics is not, in the long run, going to be a successful businessman. I feel the same thing about other kinds of eleemosynary institutions, all of which depend on the expertise of outsiders, of which businessmen are an important constituency.
You've met a lot of...
Well, of course, I will be the coat maven again. Just one final color.
The thing I want to do, too, is I look...
It's that left side. It's that left side that wants to...
That's always the left that's been giving me problems all my life.
Good comeback.
Okay, I think I saw a quote in there about you being left of Reagan for the first time in your life.
It was in one of those pictures. Maybe you got it here. Yeah, it's on that one.
That's the one.
That's
okay.
the one. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we don't want to use that.
Really?
No. I don't think that would please much of the PBS audience.
Viewership, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've got a pretty healthy business audience, too. Ready?
I'm rolling.
Okay. Well, we were talking about political leaders. You've met a lot of the world's leaders. Could you give me an idea of who's probably impressed you the most? You've been most impressed with as a person that you've come to know?
Well, I have been very lucky in terms of the number of people I have been able to meet. Part of that is my conviction that a business leader of a truly global company must take the time and have the interest in meeting those kind of people. Some of them are important in terms of the actual decision-making concerning the reason we're all in business, namely to get orders. But a lot of them are peripheral to establishing a presence in some of these countries, and so I think it's part of one's job, but it also happened to be of interest to me. I would say there are 2 or 3 people that probably in my lifetime have been really unusual leaders. One is obviously Churchill. Another, even though he led a very small country, is Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. I think he's done a remarkable job. Admittedly, we're talking about a country of less than 3 million people. But in the time I've spent with him, and I've been lucky enough to be with him for several hours on 3 or 4 different occasions, he is an incisive thinker, and he clearly has had great leadership talent that he's brought to bear on Singapore. I think you probably have to give Deng Xiaoping a lot of credit. Now, obviously, he's had some real flat sides, but I think he's done quite a remarkable job in China. The results of which are far better than the country that he took over. And obviously, there are a lot of things that we disagree that he has done in the past, but I think he's been quite an outstanding leader. So there are 3 or 4 in the world that I think over the last 30 or 40 years that I've been privileged to know that have been maybe one level above the others.
What about on the domestic scene?
Well, I certainly, in terms of presidential leadership, I think President Reagan did a remarkable job. Here, too, there are differences of opinions, but the thing that I don't think we can disagree with is that he had a straightforward, easily understood philosophy, and he never wavered from that in terms of his administration. Clarity of understanding of positions is so important in politics, and we all know people who vacillate. You never know where they're going to come from on issues. Reagan, his objectives, his message were very clear, and he ran the country against those philosophical objectives that he had, I think, rather effectively.
In your acceptance speech to the Lincoln Academy, you quoted George Bernard Shaw about the unreasonable man. Could you tell us a little bit about how why you chose that and why you find that such an interesting point?
Well, I think it's human nature to respond cooperatively to one's environment. And yet there are an awful lot of things that take the courage to be different, the courage to be unpopular, the courage to recognize the difference between being loved and being respected. And I think it is not something that is a natural inclination with a lot of people. And it's obviously overly simplistic to say that all progress are made by people who expect the world to adapt to them. But there's some truth to the fact that leadership takes the courage to be different, the courage to take positions that are unpopular, the courage to not accept the status quo. So while the quote is somewhat simplistic, I think basically it expresses a fundamental aspect of leadership that I think is important.
I'd like to turn now, if I may, to some of your outside interests. Quite an active outdoorsman, pictures of you at the South Pole, river rafting, a lot of different things. What do you get out of those activities? Let's start with photography. You love that, and you're very good at it.
Well, I am an amateur photographer. I don't have fancy equipment. And I first got interested in it as a student, and I took some pictures on a trip. I love to travel, and I've always enjoyed that. I took some pictures up on the Amazon when I was a student of some parrots. And I didn't know what they were, so when I got back, I took them into the Audubon Society, and they said, "Oh my God, we've been looking for that picture, a picture of that bird forever. What is it?" And I told them and so forth. And so that sort of started me on a career, and they as a matter of fact, they bought that picture for me, from me, which paid for my camera, which as a student I was delighted. And I haven't done very much with it until the last 5 or 6 years when I had enough time to travel some of the places I wanted, and I've enjoyed it.
What do you get out of it?
The pictures on my wall. I mean, I enjoy being outdoors. I enjoy nature. You'll notice that a lot of the pictures I've taken are in the Arctic, in the Antarctic. I tend to prefer cold weather than jungles for a reason that I haven't quite figured out. Maybe one reason is you don't see too many people there, so it doesn't get too crowded. So I've just enjoyed the things that I've, and we've taken some very unusual trips. We've been dog sledding up in Baffin Island, and we've been up chasing polar bears, as you can see from some of the pictures. Went down and lived with the emperor penguins for 4 or 5 days on the Waddell Sea. So it's not necessarily a sense of adventure, but I enjoy different types of trips, and I've taken a lot of them.
You've also served on with the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History. What's been particularly satisfying about that association?
Cut.
Okay. Okay.
I'd tell you that we might handle that differently, but to answer that question honestly, I don't think you'd run it.
Okay.
I mean, that has been the most frustrating goddamn experience of my life. But if you can say, if you can ask it if you want to ask something about some of the extracurricular activities that I've been involved in, that's fine. But if you want to make it that pointed,
Okay.
I'll tell you, I either lie, which I won't do,
Okay.
or you won't run the answer.
Well, what about your...
And incidentally, I'll tell you what the interest is if you want to answer the question again. The Natural Museum is one of the great assets of the Smithsonian, one of the great assets of the world of natural history. And I felt, when I was asked, that a board, which they were just in the process of establishing, could be a great asset to see that museum is run up to its potential. And so that's why I did it. But getting it there. So
is there a way we could address that? You've opened it up to taking public input and drawing comment.
well, just to give you background on the things that I am associated with, you can pick and choose. I'm on the board of the University of Chicago, the Board of Trustees of the University of Chicago. I'm on the National Park Board. I'm on the Aspen Institute Board. I'm on several public policy boards. Hoover, I've been chairman of that in the past. I'm on the executive committee of the American Enterprise Institute. So, you know, I have been involved in a lot of them. I'm on the Argonne board. So I don't know how you want to cover that general subject, but focusing in on the National Museum has to be done gingerly. It still could be the subject of pursuit. We could talk about it, but
well, you described it as a national asset, and how has your association with it perhaps helped it to live up to its potential? Would that be a better way of asking?
yeah. Well, why did you decide to go on the board?
Why did you decide?
Yeah, something.
Let's pick up with that.
Okay.
The Museum of Natural History. What drew your interest in that area?
Well, the board of the National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian, was only created recently as a result of an outside consulting study that indicated that even though this was a unit of the Smithsonian, it ought to have its own independent board. And they approached me and a number of other people to go on the board and then asked me to be chairman. The reason I accepted was this is one of the great natural history museums in the world. And the asset value of a museum of that stature seemed to me to justify some support and some attention. And I felt that a board of outsiders consisting of both scientists and businessmen should be able to make a major contribution to how the museum was run. And so that's the reason that I accepted the appointment.
How has it improved the museum?
Well, the jury is still out. There are a number of things that I think we've done to contribute to sharpening the focus of the museum. We've undertaken through the science committee of our board, which is chaired by a number of prominent scientists around the country, a new initiative as to how science at the museum should be undertaken. There are 130 scientists and a budget of $40 or $50 million that are spent there on research, and we thought that could be that we could take a different approach that might make research more effective. We're in the process of implementing that, and I think that's making some progress. We're addressing some of the issues of governance that I think businessmen can bring to an institution like that can improve how they operate. So I think we're making some progress.
I think that covers it well. As I draw to a close, I'd like to ask you, you've obviously been in a situation where you may have mentored younger people as they come up through corporate environments. What sort of advice would you give people as they consider a career in business? Things they should do, things that would help them along, both being successful in the world of business, but perhaps looking to things that would make them personally satisfied as well, things that they would find helpful.
Well, of course, I start with the premise that business is a fascinating career. There are a lot of people who shouldn't be given that advice because we know they wouldn't find it a fascinating career. I have found it very rewarding and very satisfying. The advice I think I would give someone who had made the decision that they wanted to go into business, I don't think I would take on the challenge of trying to convince someone who wanted to be a musician that they should become a businessman. But on the assumption that we're talking about those who have decided they want to go into the business world, I would tell them some of the things we've talked about before. Be sure that you don't over-focus on your day-to-day business requirements. I don't care where you are in the corporation. Obviously, it's easier for a chairman to spend time on extracurricular activities than it is for a person first starting out in business. But I don't think there is any reason at any level in a corporation for someone who is committed to succeed in a business career for not reaching out and participating in their external environment. And so and we've discussed this, and I think the same thing is true in politics. I think I would advise them that in most corporations today, you will not succeed unless you have had some international exposure. The world cannot function, our U.S. business cannot function successfully with leadership that doesn't understand the challenge of doing business overseas, doesn't understand the importance of different cultures, doesn't understand the difference between the role that government plays in some markets as opposed to the role that government plays in our market. So I would say that someone who's going to succeed tomorrow has got to have real hands-on experience in the international world. So that's the kind of advice I would give young people today.
One final question, and I'm asking this of all the laureates, and that has to do with their reflections upon being named a Lincoln Laureate. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think the Lincoln Academy is an institution that is unique to Illinois. I mean, I don't think any other state has anything quite like it, where they genuinely want to honor citizens of their state in a whole host of endeavors and a variety of contributions that they've made. And I think that if you look over those who have received the laureates for a whole variety of contributions that they've made, this is a very impressive group. And I think anyone who is asked would feel honored to be allowed to join such an illustrious group. So it was very pleasing to me to be asked, and very rewarding in retrospect to be a laureate of the Academy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.